Welcome to the American Red Cross Northern California Coastal Region Speaker Series session. We will begin the program momentarily. Welcome and thank you for joining the American Red Cross Northern California Coastal Region Speaker Series session. My name is Veronica Oberholzer, and I am the Development Operations Manager for this region. We are thrilled to have you join today's conversation and hope you will leave more informed and inspired about the work of the Red Cross. Today's session is being recorded and you are in listen-only mode so we can give our full attention to today's speakers. If you have any questions or comments throughout the session, feel free to submit them in the chat box where I will review and compile them. We will try to get to as many of them as possible during our question and answer session towards the end of the program. Remaining questions will be answered in a follow-up email along with a recording and a survey. Today you will hear from outstanding guest speakers who will share how the American Red Cross is supporting people struggling to cope after being driven from their homes by worsening disasters due to the climate crisis. We are making strategic investments to grow our capacity and adapt our services to help families when they need it most. With that, I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Hannah Malik. We welcomed Hannah as our regional CEO of the Northern California Coastal Region in July 2022. Hannah leads a team of more than 7,000 volunteers and 75 employees to provide Red Cross programs and services to more than 10 million residents across 15 counties throughout our 5 chapters. Most recently, Hannah served as the Regional Donor Services Executive for the Western New York Blood Services region, and he brings more than a decade of leadership and Red Cross experience to his new role. He has deployed to multiple disaster response operations, including California wildfires, and is a committed blood donor with more than 100 donations to date. Thank you and welcome, Hannah.
Thank you, Veronica. And it's good to be with everyone this afternoon. Like Veronica said, I've been at the Red Cross for over 10 years and in many different capacities from the West Coast to the East Coast. And the one thing that's been constant is how dedicated our generous donors, our volunteers, and our employees have been. They think innovatively and they help adapt to the times. It's no secret that this year has been very busy for the Red Cross. We've responded to typhoons, wildfires, earthquakes here domestically and across the United States. Wanted to talk a little bit about how we are focused through our different lines of service to help with the climate crisis. First is blood services. We are 40% of the nation's blood, and every 2 seconds, someone needs blood in the US. That could be a baby at birth, a mother giving birth, an innocent person in a car accident, can't make blood, we can't manufacture it, we only get it from volunteer blood donors. The need for blood is something that's really personal to me. My older brother, Charlie, had leukemia growing up and received multiple blood transfusions, and he wouldn't be alive today if it wasn't for the Red Cross and for our dedicated donors who step up to save lives. A couple photos of his undergrad graduation, and now it's full circle. He is a nurse, and his white coat ceremony with my proud mom and dad. So again, thank you to our blood donors. Here in Northern California, we are very excited about the different blood centers and opportunities that we have across the region. We celebrated our 2-year birthday for our San Francisco Donor Center in August, and in January, we opened our donor center in Oakland, just making it more convenient for donors to find a space to donate blood and help save lives. Next is our training services. We train folks to be prepared with life-saving skills like CPR, first aid, knowing how to use an AED for when the time comes. And that preparedness is really, really important. We want folks to be Red Cross ready, to get a kit, make a plan, and stay informed. Next is our international services. We work alongside our Red Cross and Red Crescent societies all across the world to respond to disasters, to prepare communities. We help reunify families during crises, and we saw that during the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine this year. We were there and in the surrounding countries helping reunify folks. We help people. We're trying to end the measles and rubella disease across the world, and we do that with our partnership with our Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. Next is our service to the armed forces, a line of service that we were founded for over 140 years ago. When military members enlist in the military, here locally, they go right outside of Moffett Field to a military entrance processing station and fill out a contact card so that we're able to let them know and their family members know about our emergency communications so we can bring a service member back for happy events like births or some sad events like funerals. And we also help people through resiliency workshops and family members. So we help service members through their whole entire life cycle as a service member. Next, I want to talk about our disaster relief and response. I won't go into too much depth because we have some awesome speakers who are going to do that, but just know that when a disaster happens, the Red Cross is there. Mostly through small events like home fires. When the fire department puts the fire out, they'll call the Red Cross. We'll send some dedicated volunteers out to provide some financial assistance, some comfort kits, and help people through that recovery. Also, big disasters, we like to get people out of harm's way and make sure their basic needs are being met. Once the initial disaster is done, we have caseworkers help our disaster folks that were impacted through that long road of recovery. And we're only able to do that because of our volunteers. 90% of our workforce are volunteers, and because of the generosity of our donors. So we're so grateful for that. So just wanted to give that quick recap and just excited for the remaining speakers that we have for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. I'd now like to introduce you to Jennifer Pippa, Vice President of Disaster Programs for the American Red Cross. She has been with the Red Cross for 19 years and oversees the nationwide development, implementation, and continuous improvement of the Red Cross Disaster Cycle Services programs. I will turn it over to Pippa, as she prefers to be called, to share more about how the organization is adapting, innovating, and collaborating to provide essential support to affected communities, all while tackling the root causes of these crises head on. Welcome, Pippa.
Thanks, Veronica. As Veronica mentioned, I have the distinct privilege and honor of leading our disaster services unit at national headquarters, supporting all the amazing work that Hannah and some of the folks you're going to hear from here today talk about. So it's my extreme honor and pleasure to be here today. If we could go to the next slide, please. So what you'll see here is a chart. It's a chart that is heading in the wrong direction. What you see here in the bottom left corner is the average number of billion-dollar disasters that we had back in 1980, in the early 80s. And what you're seeing there was about on average, we were experiencing 3 really significant large-scale disaster relief operations each and every year. Unfortunately, as this chart shows, that has grown exponentially over time. This year alone, there have been $25 billion disasters. That is a record year for the US. And this is because of the climate crisis that we are experiencing, not just on the coasts where you all are, but in the center of the US as well. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is the green bar on these charts. Those are severe storms. You can see that they're increasing over time. These are incredibly hard to predict. There's often little or no warning that a severe storm is going to take place, and those severe storms have the ability to take place anywhere. That means it could be in California, but it could also be in Des Moines, Iowa, in Arkansas, in Vermont, like we saw flooding earlier this year. So anywhere across the US now is not free from the potential impacts of the climate crisis that we're experiencing every single year here. The other problem is with disaster, you're really in one of two phases. You are either preparing to respond or you are responding. Back in the 1980s, we had a lot of time to prepare to respond, to rest, to recover, to replenish. Nowadays, we are launching a large disaster relief operation on average every 12 to 14 days across the US. That means that our ability to respond is being taxed and challenged at a phenomenal rate that as an organization we need to acknowledge and need to make sure that the mission delivery that we are doing is in fact meeting the needs in these communities and that we are able to scale to meet the volume and the level of disasters that we're going to see all across the US. Just this year alone, in August, we saw these devastating wildfires in Maui, and not but a couple weeks later, Hurricane Idalia, who made landfall in the Florida Panhandle. Those disasters are 4,700 miles apart. Yet each one of those families and communities rely on our organization to make sure we are there at a moment's notice to provide the hope, compassion, and care that each one of them so deserve and come to expect from our organization. If we could go to the next slide. We can't keep doing things the way we used to do things. We have to look at how we deliver our mission and how we can adapt it to be effective and efficient and be there for every community that may be impacted because of this climate crisis. So because of that, there's a couple of different areas that we're really focusing on in disaster specifically. The first is growing our disaster network. We need more volunteers. We want to make sure that we have enough volunteers to respond to each one of these disasters. To run large-scale concurrent disaster relief operations separated by 4,700 miles means that we rely on the generosity of our donors and the humanitarian spirit of our volunteers to travel all across the country to make sure that we are there to take care of those families. We're launching a community adaptation program, and I'm going to tell you more about that in just a couple minutes. But this enhancing sheltering and casework practices. When folks think about shelters, they think about gymnasiums and community centers. You think about our cots and our blankets, but there is so much more that occurs inside the four walls of a shelter that many people don't know about. The trauma that families experience having to evacuate their home, likely knowing that their home is no longer there and that the life that they once knew is going to be immaterially changed because of this disaster, means that they have to learn how to cope with that trauma. We have licensed medical health professionals there to provide tools and coping mechanisms to help these families begin to process what their new normal may in fact look like. When folks leave their homes, a lot of times they forget life-saving medications. And so they may be at our shelters and not have access to heart medication or diabetes medication or insulin. We have nurses on staff here to make sure that we can fulfill those prescriptions and take excellent care of every person who can't find their way back home after a disaster. And then the last is more and more families are evacuating and turning to our organization for help and hope and compassion, and more families are asking for additional financial resources. So growing that program is critical in making sure that families can continue their recovery process. Next slide, please. First one I want to talk about is a community adaptation program. This is really more of an international kind of focus than you see us historically do domestically. These are investments in all of these communities listed under the FY24 CAP locations all across the US. These are communities that, when we look at the data, are struggling every single day. These are hometowns that may not have access to broadband internet, may have transportation barriers, may have low literacy rates. These are communities that on their best day, these families are continuing to struggle. And then this struggle is exacerbated by repeated impacts because of disasters. Each one of these locations that we have chosen have been repetitively impacted by large-scale disasters sometime in the last 7 years, and they were already socially vulnerable before that disaster even happened. When you go back to communities who have been repetitively impacted, we know that their resiliency is really, really taxed. And the three primary barriers that we see are access to affordable, accessible housing, healthcare and mental health resource providers, and food insecurity. Sometimes folks are in our shelters not because they can't return home, but because the social service entities that they rely on in their community every single day have been taken offline because of that disaster. And so because of that, they turn to the American Red Cross. We believe investments in subject matter expertise, in training, in capacity building in these communities alongside those social service partners is the key to improving the access to recovery resources that each one of these families so desperately needs over time. And so these are the first 15 that we've had. We will be adding more as the years go on. In fact, we've just decided we're going to add an additional 5 this fiscal year alone. And we hope to see that this will speed the recovery and make a more meaningful recovery for those families who are impacted and can't return home. If you go to the next slide, I just want to give you a quick example of one real life example of what we've done. Yazoo County, Mississippi is one of the first places we chose to make these investments. And this is G.A. Carmichael Family Health Center. So in the Yazoo County, it can be 20 miles between areas where you can find medical help and support. And for a county that doesn't have a public transportation system, and for families that don't have their own vehicles, 20 miles might as well be 200. And so what Carmichael said is what we really need help with is building a mobile clinic. And so that's what we talked with them about. And we've invested in this social service provider to make sure that they have a mobile health clinic. But we did more than that. We taught them how to integrate their services into a disaster relief operation. So in March, when those devastating tornadoes touched down in Mississippi and absolutely demolished multiple communities there, Yazoo County is just south of Rolling Forks. That's where the actual tornado made landfall and touched down. They didn't wait for the Red Cross to show up and tell them where to go. They knew. They had talked with us. We had trained together. They immediately went north to Rolling Forks, where the community was gathering, and provided critical first aid at that moment in time that night to make sure that that community could begin their recovery as well. They walked alongside our organization, and together we better supported that community in the immediate aftermath and through the long-term recovery that we are continuing to support there. That is the absolute pinnacle of what we want to see in these investments, empowering these agencies to show up to help their own community recover on the very worst day that they're experiencing. And then the last slide, if you would, please. Financial assistance. This is a major piece, and sometimes people don't understand all of the ways that folks can access financial resources to us. On day one, if you show up in a shelter and you've lost your medication or you had some kind of medical assistive device that you weren't able to evacuate with, we can provide financial resources for you to go and replace those things. That is a much needed, critical, at that moment of crisis, resource that folks need, and we are able to provide that immediately. As things begin to settle and folks start looking on how to move from a shelter location into safe, sustainable housing, this is the critical point where we can provide what we call shelter resident transition assistance. This is where we talk with the family. What do you need in order to move on? It might be your first month's rent. It might be a security deposit. It might be repairs to your vehicle so you can go stay with family elsewhere and continue to retain your employment. Those are financial resources that we make available immediately after we open our shelters so that folks can continue on their recovery journey. And then anywhere from about 2 to 3 months after the disaster, we do our first round of what we call immediate assistance. This is financial assistance to folks who cannot return home. These are folks who have lost their homes, they're no longer livable, and these folks are going to be permanently displaced. And so we provide them immediate assistance. This is assistance in form of cash because every family recovers differently, and we believe there is dignity and respect in providing access to financial resources so that they can choose the recovery path that works best for them and their family. And then 3 to 6 months after a disaster, we now also provide what's called bridge assistance. There are families that 6 months later are still struggling to overcome recovery barriers. And so we connect with those families again. We talk about what those barriers are, and we're able to provide yet another round of financial assistance. And then 1 year and beyond on these really large scale disaster relief operations, we have what's called expanded recovery assistance. This is individual casework with a family along with all the other nonprofits that are still there providing assistance. And when there isn't anybody else that can help fund that family's continued recovery journey, we play a critical role in providing that service. So even though there are only 4 columns on here, there's actually 5 different ways you can interact with our organization in your recovery journey, and we can provide access to additional financial resources to help you begin and continue on your recovery journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Pippa, for sharing. A lot of great work is being done. I know our audience may have a few questions for Hannah and Pippa, so please submit any questions you may have for any of our speakers in the Q&A feature. We will get through as many as we can towards the end of the program. With that, it is my honor to introduce you to our Mission Moment speaker today, Katie Sullivan. Katie first joined the Red Cross in 2016 as a disaster program specialist in central Louisiana. After a brief hiatus to work in EMS, she rejoined the team as the Regional Mass Care and Logistics Manager for Louisiana before coming out to the West Coast to take on her current role of Disaster Program Manager for Alameda County. While with the Red Cross, Katie has deployed to numerous disasters across the United States, including Hurricanes Irma and Maria, Hurricanes Laura and Delta, the Mayfield, Kentucky tornadoes, Hurricane Ian, and the Maui wildfires. She currently lives in Oakland with her very friendly cat, Regulus. Welcome, Katie.
Hey, thank you so much, Veronica. Good afternoon, and I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me to be a part of this today. It's a real honor. As Veronica mentioned, my name's Katie Sullivan. I've been with the Red Cross for about 7 years now. In that time, I've worked in 2 states, 3 divisions, and had a lot of different roles, including my absolute favorite role, which was the 2 years I got to spend as a volunteer. But all of that's been what I call my blue skies hat. Whereas in gray skies or disaster operational mode, I switch over to my first true Red Cross love, which is sheltering. In that role, I've worked a lot of disasters over the years, but most recently, I responded to the Maui wildfires. So it's that latest response that I wanted to talk a little bit about today, because it's had a really profound impact on me and on the work that I do every day in my day job. So typically, when I head out to a disaster to deploy and support sheltering, I usually work more behind the scenes. As the headquarters sheltering manager, it's my job to coordinate across not just one shelter, but all of the shelters to make sure that they have the staff, the stuff, and the support that they need to do the important work of serving survivors. So a typical day for me involves keeping track of up to about 20 shelters and their very unique needs. And then, of course, pleasantly nagging other folks at headquarters to make sure that our survivors are served and get what they need. But a really important part of that role is to make sure that we're going out and doing site visits at our shelters to make sure that our team has what they need and that the survivors they are helping are receiving a true quality service. So these visits, they generally tend to be pretty brief, usually no more than an hour at any given site. But Maui is a little different for me. During my visit to the War Memorial Gymnasium shelter in Wailuku, which was kind of the main shelter on the island where most of the center of gravity was, it just didn't go to that plan. Instead of an hour, I found myself there for 4 hours. And during that time, I got the chance to talk to our shelter team, to some of the survivors, but most impactfully for me, to the community members who had been working at the shelter since the fires began. And it's just a conversation. We sat down for around 2 hours that I am never going to forget, and has really reframed the way that I approach this work. So when the fires first began, our Red Cross volunteers on Maui did everything they could to get shelters stood up. But these were unprecedented wildfires in West Maui, and that meant that some of those shelters were opened up by Red Crossers working with locals. Some of them were opened up by locals who had never done this before. And so the folks that I spoke to, they had been there from the beginning, and it was just incredibly clear to me that this was truly a labor of love for them. Some of them were people who had lost or whose family members were missing, but they were still showing up every day to take care of the members of their community. And they weren't going to stop doing that until they were 100% sure that that work was going to continue with that same level of care and compassion. But at the same time, these folks were humble enough to acknowledge that they were very new to this. And they were happy to have us there because we could provide that expertise, that experience, and the support so that we could turn these shelters into a quality experience, or as much as possible, for the survivors there. So for the rest of my time in Maui, my goal really was to make sure that we earned that trust that they were putting in us. And that as we continue to operate these shelters and transition them to non-congregate shelters, that we continue that tradition of love and care like these were our own family members. And you can go to the next slide now. But now that I'm home and back here in Alameda in Oakland, I'm still thinking about the lessons that I took away from that. So we're here today to talk about the climate crisis and how that it affects disaster response. And the truth of it is part of what that climate crisis means is that there are communities, including our own, that are going to be faced like Maui was, with disasters on a scale that they have never seen before. And that means that in the first few hours, in the first few days, they're going to need to stand up like the people of Maui did for their neighbors and their members of their community. So for those of you who might not be as familiar with Alameda County, we have running right through our major population center something called the Hayward Fault, which is unfortunately very well overdue for a major earthquake. But we also face a significant wildfire risk, something that we saw with the 91 Oakland Berkeley Hill fires, which destroyed hundreds of homes right in the urban center. So when these things happen, we're going to need to stand up like they did in Maui. And I know the people in this county are going to want to help like the people of Maui helped their neighbors and their fellow islanders. So it's really important for me as my daily job to make sure that I'm giving them the tools to do that. I have the chance now, before the disaster happens, to give them the tools and the confidence to do that work. So here in Alameda County, in addition to our regular work of building our shelter teams, doing shelter surveys and getting practice, community readiness has really become a cornerstone of how I approach this work. Every time we do a shelter training, we're doing it for partner groups as well, whether that's to a local CERT team, which is the Community Emergency Response Team, or to local government staff. Every time we have a skill builder here at the Oakland office, we open it up to community members as well. To anyone that we've done a partner training for, come out, come practice with us. We want you to be ready to help your community when you're needed. It doesn't matter to us what color vest you're wearing, just that you know what you're doing and you're ready to help. So in that way, I like to think that we're kind of keeping the spirit of the whole community and the real aloha spirit of Maui, or at least alive here in Alameda. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie, for sharing your incredible story and experience. We thank you for all that you continue to do in support of our community, often at a moment's notice. And thank you once again to all of our speakers for providing such valuable information. We've had a lot of great questions come in that we will jump right into. This first question is for Katie. How does the Red Cross help prepare the community in case another disaster hits again?
Sure. So I like to think of preparedness as two-pronged. Firstly, there's our personal preparedness, our personal readiness. So we do things like go out into the community and we do things like be Red Cross ready so that folks are able to make a plan, get a kit, and be informed. We teach them about having an emergency kit. I just finished mine last week. I'm very proud of it. And things that they can do to keep their own families ready with their emergency plan. We also have some programs that specifically target youth. So things like our Prepare with Pedro project, Prepare with Pedro program rather, lots of P's, that targets youth in grades K through 2. But beyond that, we also do things like review local mass care plans with the county, with especially in Alameda County here with city governments, to make sure that their shelters that they are planning to use are up to date, that we've inspected them and know how they would be used, and then providing training for our own volunteers and as well as their volunteers and staff.
Thank you, Katie. This next question is for Pippa. As the climate crisis continues to escalate, how is the Red Cross adapting its long-term strategies to build resilience in communities and promote sustainable recovery?
I think there's a couple different ways that we've kind of knitted that into our responses now. I think a lot of times people don't always realize that during these large-scale disaster relief operations, we are there for months, sometimes years after the disaster has happened, because there are significant unmet needs in the community that need to be addressed. We may not be the solution for all of them. They may not fall inside the Red Cross mission, but we know that we have the power to convene and bring other nonprofits together. So when a family has got multiple recovery roadblocks, there may be other entities that we can help connect that family with. The other piece we do is that sometimes during our long-term recovery, we do have money that the donors have so generously given to us that have been designated to that response. We have a lot of folks who said, I want the money that I'm donating to the Red Cross to go to the Maui wildfires. And we take that solicitation and that designation from the donor incredibly seriously. And so sometimes we may not spend all of those dollars in the response phase. That allows us the opportunity to provide additional resources in the long-term recovery. And when we do that, we typically grant some of that money out to other nonprofit partners. It helps build their resiliency so that the next time a disaster happens, they're more ready and prepared to go. And part of what we do is when we talk to folks like Habitat for Humanity or other local nonprofits that rebuild houses, we ask them to embed in that some sustainability options, whether it's low flow faucets, solar panels on homes. Sometimes when we do things, it's about mitigation for wildfires, for not putting gutters on, or for removing debris around homes, or closing in the soffits, which we all know are extra mitigations that we can provide in folks' houses to make them more resilient and more resistant to wildfire impact. And so that's a lot of what we're doing moving forward. The other pieces is that we understand now that the length of time it takes a family to recover is significantly longer today than it's historically been. Those March tornadoes that I talked about, we are still providing care for more than 100 families in Mississippi right now. We know the folks in Maui have an incredibly long and challenging recovery that they're going to have to navigate. And that means as an organization, we need to make sure that we're there present to walk alongside those families as they continue that recovery. Those may not be things that you see in the news, because after the first couple of news cycles, the general population just kind of moves on to whatever the next thing is in that cycle. Our organization doesn't do that. We take our responsibilities very seriously, and we make sure that we're there to continue to support that community in their recovery efforts.
Thank you, Pippa. This next question is for Katie. What has been your biggest takeaway during these deployments that you carry on to your next deployment?
Thank you so much, Veronica. It's a good question. I think the biggest thing that I've taken away from any deployment I've done, and also from when I've responded to local disasters in my own community, is the importance of having that local understanding. It is one thing for us to send, we have very experienced, very quality volunteers, and our workforce knows what they're doing. But if they're not willing to listen to that local community and reflect what their needs are, we're going to miss something. And I think it's something that we're getting a lot better at, and that I'm really proud of, and it's something that I try to bring to every response that I do. So I don't know if that answers it.
Absolutely. Thank you. This next question is for Hannah. How does the American Red Cross collaborate with other organizations and stakeholders to create a more comprehensive and effective response to climate-related humanitarian crises?
Thanks for the question, Veronica. There's a saying in disaster that during a disaster is not the time to be handing out business cards. So what we call in blue sky, our non-disaster times, are working around the clock to build relationships and partnerships with different local organizations so that when the time comes, we know each other, we know what we're able to do, and we partner with each other. During a disaster, we have teams focused on community engagement and partnerships, focused on building those partnerships between the different nonprofits and supporting recovery. And then also at the local level, our disaster program managers, our executive directors, they work with groups like the VOADs, which is the volunteer organizations that are active during disasters and have those relationships so that they know each other when the time comes.
Thank you, Hannah. This next question is for Pippa. Given the disproportionate impact of climate change on vulnerable communities, how does the Red Cross ensure that its initiatives are inclusive and address the unique needs of those most affected?
So that's an amazing question. I think there's a couple of different answers there, right? And the first actually happens well before the disaster ever even occurs. And this is the great and awesome responsibility that Hannah and his team are challenged with. It is knowing all of the communities that you serve and understanding them and how they want to interact with our organization. What provides value and support if they are impacted during a disaster? Every community that we support is unique. And so we want to be culturally sensitive and make sure that we are meeting that community where they are at that moment in time. And we rely on the folks in the region and the volunteers to have great, healthy, deep relationships with those communities so that when a disaster does impact that community, and we turn to Hannah and his leadership team, we ask them, where are there going to be communities that might not present to the Red Cross for whatever reason? Where are communities that are more likely to stay in a home that's damaged and we need to do outreach to them? And we take that intrinsic, really important knowledge. We also pair that with data. We use the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. That helps us understand, are there communities out there that don't have access to transportation and maybe don't have access to broadband or sustainable, reliable internet access? That means that we have to make sure that we have boots on the ground, that we have volunteers out there in that community canvassing, providing them the opportunity to understand how they can engage with our organization. It means we rely on those community leaders as trust conveyors to say that this is an organization that is here to help you, that we won't share your information if you don't want it shared, that the American Red Cross is here to give you a gift. This isn't a loan. You don't have to pay it back, and that we're here to be compassionate and caring. That also means that when you have 15 or 20 communities that are all impacted, there are some communities that are much more resilient, that have transportation, that have access to internet. And so it doesn't mean that we won't help that community. It just means that we need to know which communities we need to be in first, because we're going to be there longest, because they have more barriers that exist even on every single day in order to make sure that they have access to that services. And that's a critical piece that really requires both the local leadership at the region and our deployed responders in to have a very, very good relationship as we begin to stand up that recovery effort and start to support those families. The thing that keeps us up at night isn't the people who show up at our shelter. It's the people who need help that don't. And making sure that we can find them, treat them with the respect that they deserve, and support them in what their recovery wants to look like is a critical piece that we continue to strive for in this organization.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pippa. I'd like to remind our audience that you are welcome to submit any questions that you have for any of our speakers in the Q&A feature. Our next question is for Hannah. What is the breakdown of where disaster financial assistance comes from? For example, what percentage comes from individuals, corporations, or the government? What is the annual budget?
It's a great question. We're able to respond to disasters, small and large, through the generosity of donors. That comes from individuals, foundations, and corporations. We don't know when a disaster is going to hit. We don't know how complex it's going to be in terms of the costs, but we do have partnerships in line through our annual disaster giving program, and those partners give to us in advance and allow us to train our volunteers, pre-position our supplies so that we're able to respond when a disaster happens. So those are the big partners, and even the small partners. I was at a middle school a couple months ago that collectively the second grade class raised $500, and it meant the world to them to know that they were making an impact. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you, Hannah. This next question is for Katie. How did you take care of yourself emotionally when you came home from Maui?
Thanks. It's a really good question. I will not deny that was a particularly impactful deployment on me. So, I mean, I think everyone kind of has the same techniques, but I took a couple days for myself. I gave that cat a very large hug. He was most displeased, but it was good. And just kind of spend some time, just relax and kind of decompress before stepping back. But the thing that has really helped me post-Maui has been honestly turning that into what I do every day, and to trying to make sure that our programs, that we're really getting our folks ready, and that we're providing the quality training so that next time we respond to something like that, our folks are ready for it and that they're prepared to provide really good service to our survivors. So in a weird way, the shelter skill builders that we might do on a weekend, that's kind of how I cope with Maui, is knowing that we're going to be ready for the next one.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you everyone for submitting these questions for us. We've answered all of the questions, so I'd like to have Hannah wrap up today's session with a few closing remarks.
Awesome. Thank you, Veronica. And just want to end with a huge thank you for the continued support. Whether you are a new supporter of the Red Cross or have been supporting us for decades, as you heard, because of the climate crisis, the need is greater now than ever. So thank you. I also want to thank our amazing speakers who shared their stories and important information with us. Before we go, I have some homework for you. I know you signed up and said, I didn't sign up for any homework, but my ask of you is to take some of the information that you learned today, share it with your family, share it with your friends. Download one of our free Red Cross apps. There's a great first aid app, an emergency app, some great information there. Sign up to take a CPR class, sign up to donate blood, sign up to volunteer and join us. So there you have it. You have your homework for the day. Keep an eye out for a follow-up email. We'll answer any questions that didn't get answered. We'll have a recording and a short survey in there for you to fill out. I'm really excited for calendar year 2022 to 24 and excited to see you at the next speaker series. Happy holidays and thank you for the continued support.